Do you have an opinion as to whether or not NATO should offer some kind of path to membership for Ukraine now, and whether that would have an impact in a way that would, make it clear to Putin that he can't outweight us, that, his attitude is, well, if you can't get into NATO because it's a war, then I'm going to keep the war going, and I've got more people, and now my economy's producing again, and I'm making a lot of ammunition. Do you have an opinion about that?
It's a very hard question. So Fogh Rasmussen, the former Secretary General of NATO, called me the other day to have this very conversation. What makes it difficult, immediate NATO entry for Ukraine, is that we have something called Article 5 in NATO. So if any one NATO member is attacked, all of the NATO members have to respond, or at least there's a council that's called together, and the implication is that all the member countries will get involved in the war. And look, as much as I can't stand the Russians and I want to support Ukraine, I don't want to see American men and women in uniform fighting the Russians. And keep in mind, the Russians, I think Jim Baker called them a gas station with the nuclear weapons. I mean, they still have 1,250 strategic nuclear weapons pointed at us. So the escalation with the Russians is something we want to avoid reasonably. We can't be blackmailed because they've got nukes, but we've got to be careful. So what I've recommended, instead of immediate NATO membership, which could lead to U.S. troops, and I've got two daughters, Lomer and I have two daughters who serve in the military. One was deployed to Poland recently, and the other's training to fly a C-130, so she'd be involved. Look, I don't want them fighting Russians right now. I think we can do, and the Ukrainians haven't asked us to fight the Russians for them yet, but so I think we need to avoid that. What can be done immediately is I think the EU needs to step up and give them EU membership. And I know there's a long bureaucratic path to EU membership for Ukraine. We need to give Ukraine EU membership immediately, cut through the bureaucracy, get it done. It doesn't involve a military commitment like NATO would, but it would send a very strong message to Putin that Ukraine is part of Europe, that it's going to be integrated into Europe fully, and he's never going to get a hold of it. So that would be my compromise. But look, down the road, I think NATO membership is fully appropriate for Ukraine, but I think that's a ways down the road.
Will this new supply of weapons and support enable them to hold the line with the Russians? Will you be optimistic about what they can do given the somewhat disadvantaged position they're starting from now?
Well, I guess I start with the missed opportunity, because I agree with Robert. I think that there was a time we would all remember at the beginning of the war when Ukraine surprised the world and resisted. And I think that whether it be Democrats, Republicans, Independents, throughout the Ukrainian flags flying in front of people's houses, and the momentum and I think a will to understand the reality of it was so present, and that was really the time where the country had momentum to supply them. So the question now is we have to see how the supplemental works, how fast the weapons get in. I know that there was some reporting that the president had found some other means previously, that things were beginning to move. I'm hearing there is prepositioned equipment in Poland moving. We'll see how quickly it gets to it. I've made the argument from the beginning, and I feel that there was far too much caution, that the likelihood of Putin using nuclear weapons was very low to begin with, and I think remains so. And I don't say that just as an actor from Hollywood with an opinion, but somebody who's had the access to the better minds in the room on it. Especially
you've met Putin as well, haven't you?
Sorry?
You've met Putin?
I've met Putin also, and I would say the thing, by extension, and President Zelensky speaks about this, one of the things about Putin that's, is that he's deeply uninteresting and undistracted by nuance. And so there's a sort of savantism to things that are not what we want to offer our kids in compassion, humanity, or even inventiveness. And so it would be very inventive for him to use nuclear weapons in a way that might impact trade throughout the world. The Russians, the Chinese wouldn't appreciate it, I don't think, very much either. So what's he got? And the war stops when the Russians stop fighting. And so what does it make to make the Russians stop fighting? I think it's going to take some stings on the inside of Russia with the long-range stuff. And the Ukrainians are so resilient, so in the fight, but man, they've been being punished for a couple of straight years. And so, you know, what's happened has been miraculous. I really think that we have to renew our commitment to paying attention and to rallying strength to the Ukrainians, because they're still made of flesh and blood. They fortunately have this guy who, you know, in that moment from the 23rd to the 24th, all of us that had the privilege of being in that room with him on that day, it was two different creatures. And he clearly, on the 24th, it was clear in his face, he'd been born for this leadership. But as is said in the movie, there's a national tradition of disillusionment. And so you know, things do tend to implode from the inside. And so I think we have to help Ukraine not implode from the inside, and that they will succeed in resisting the Russians.